The year was 1884, and the land held its breath under the weight of a brassy, unforgiving sun. For Arthur Blackwood, the silence of his homestead was a physical presence, a thick blanket woven from dust and grief. It had settled over him the day he buried Cora, and it had not lifted in the 2 years since. His farm, once a testament to hope carved from the wild prairie, was now an echo of his own hollowed-out spirit. Fences sagged like weary shoulders, and the fields lay fallow, choked with the stubborn weeds that thrived on neglect. Each day was a ritual of diminishment. Arthur moved through the motions of survival, his actions stripped of purpose. He milked his one remaining cow, its lowing a lonely question in the vast emptiness. He tended a small garden, just enough to sustain a life he no longer felt was his own. The house itself, built with his own hands for a future that had turned to ash, was a museum of loss. Cora's rocking chair sat by the cold hearth, a silent sentinel guarding a ghost. The small cradle he had sanded to a perfect smoothness was tucked away in the loft, a wound he could not bear to look upon. Grief was not a sharp pain anymore. It was the soil under his feet, the air in his lungs. It had weight and texture. It was the grit in the bread he baked from his dwindling flour and the taste of the water he drew from the well. He spoke to no one for weeks at a time, the sound of his own voice becoming a stranger's when he had to soothe the cow or curse at a stubborn root. The nearest settlement was a half-day's ride, and he had long since ceased making the journey. The pitying glances and clumsy condolences of the townsfolk were harder to bear than the solitude. They saw a man broken by tragedy. They could not see the architecture of his sorrow, the way it had rebuilt him from the inside out into something hard and inaccessible. He was hauling water from the well, the rope biting into his calloused hands, when he first saw the figure. It was a shimmer in the heat haze at the edge of his property, a disturbance in the monotonous landscape. He paused, muscles tensed. Strangers were rarely a blessing. He watched as the figure stumbled, fell to one knee, and then pushed itself back up with a visible, gut-wrenching effort. It was not a rider, and it was not a man walking with purpose. It was someone at the very end of their strength. Arthur set the bucket down, his hand moving instinctively toward the axe handle leaning against the well. He was not a man who sought trouble, but he had learned that trouble often came uninvited. As the figure drew closer, staggering through the tall, dry grass, the details sharpened. It was a native man, old and frail, his face a mask of deep lines and exhaustion. His clothes were worn, and he carried no weapon that Arthur could see, only a deep and abiding weariness that seemed to pull him toward the earth. He was dying. It was not a guess, it was a certainty, as clear as the merciless blue of the sky. The man's eyes, when they finally lifted to meet Arthur's, held no fear, only a profound and final dignity. The man collapsed not 20 yards from the cabin door, a quiet surrender to gravity. Arthur stood frozen for a long moment, the silence rushing back in, now filled with a new and pressing tension. A part of him, the hard, calloused part that had grown over his heart like a scar, wanted to turn away. To walk back inside, bar the door, and let the prairie claim what it would. It was the law of this land, wasn't it? The weak perished. He had learned that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. But another part of him, a voice he thought had died with Cora, whispered a dissent. It was the voice that remembered her kindness, her belief that even in a harsh world, a man's worth was measured by his compassion. He saw not an Indian, not a threat, but a fellow creature at the precipice of death. With a sigh that felt like it tore something loose inside him, Arthur let the axe handle go. He walked slowly toward the fallen man, his boots scuffing in the thick dust. He knelt. The man's breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. His skin was hot and dry to the touch. Arthur's hands, clumsy from disuse in any gentle task, moved to check for wounds. He found an old, poorly healed injury on the man's side, inflamed and angry, but it was the fever and the profound exhaustion that were killing him. Without a word, Arthur slid his arms under the man's thin frame. He was lighter than a sack of feed. The effort of lifting him was nothing compared to the weight of the decision he had just made. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and sorrow. Arthur laid the old man on his own cot, the only bed in the house. The man's eyes flickered open, dark and surprisingly lucid. They swept the small, sparse room, taking in the clean-swept floor, the neatly stacked firewood, the empty rocking chair. They were not the eyes of a beggar. They were the eyes of a king surveying a foreign land. Arthur worked with a grim, functional efficiency. He fetched a basin of cool water and a clean rag, wiping the grime and sweat from the man's face. He spooned a little water between the dry, cracked lips. The man drank, a flicker of gratitude in his gaze. For the rest of the afternoon, they existed in a shared silence, broken only by the sound of the man's labored breathing and the quiet movements of Arthur tending to him. As dusk bruised the sky into shades of purple and orange, Arthur took stock of his larder. There was a heel of dry bread, a few potatoes, and the last of a thin rabbit stew he had made days ago. It was meant to be his meal for tonight and the next day. It was, quite literally, all he had. He looked at the man on the cot, a stranger who had brought an unwelcome complication to his ordered misery. Then he looked at the stew. He thought of Cora, who had never once turned away a hungry traveler, who believed that sharing a meal was a sacred thing. He built up the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows that made the cabin feel both smaller and less empty. He reheated the stew, the meager aroma filling the room. He propped the old man up, supporting his back with his own body. He held the spoon to the man's lips, feeding him as one would a child. The man ate slowly, his eyes never leaving Arthur's face. He was not just consuming food, he was consuming the nature of his host. He was tasting the sacrifice, the reluctance, the deeply buried kernel of goodness that had prompted the act. When the stew was gone, Arthur broke the bread in two and gave the larger piece to his guest. After the meal, a measure of strength seemed to return to the old man. He gestured for more water, and when Arthur held the cup for him, he spoke for the first time. His voice was a dry rustle, like leaves skittering across hard ground, and he spoke in a mix of Lakota and fractured English. "I am Tashunka," he said, the name spoken with a quiet pride that defied his condition. He was a chief. Arthur felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. This was not some lone wanderer. This was a man of importance, a man whose absence would be noted. "You are, good spirit," Tashunka continued, his gaze intense. "The grief, Walker, but your heart is not stone." He saw it. He saw the sorrow that clung to Arthur like a shroud. Arthur said nothing, merely nodding. There was no defense against a truth so plainly seen. Over the next 2 days, a strange peace settled in the cabin. Arthur tended to the chief, and Tashunka, in his moments of clarity, talked. He spoke of his people, of the shrinking lands and the fading buffalo. He spoke of a world that was vanishing before his eyes, and most of all he spoke of his daughters, 5 of them. He spoke their names like a prayer: Winona, Istas, Wachiwi, Zitkala, Mina. He described their strengths, their fears, his deep and abiding love for them. He was not just a chief losing his world, he was a father terrified for the future of his children. Listening to Tashunka, Arthur felt an unfamiliar stirring. The chief's grief was vast and communal, the sorrow of a whole people. His own felt small and selfish in comparison. But the core of it, the fear of a father for his children, was a language Arthur understood. It resonated with the silent, aching space in the loft where the cradle sat. He found himself speaking of Cora, of the boy they never got to name. The words came out rusty and stiff, but they came. In the presence of a dying man, Arthur Blackwood began to speak of the dead. On the morning of the 3rd day, the air in the cabin was different. It was still, expectant. Tashunka's breathing was quieter, smoother. Arthur approached the cot and saw that the fever had broken. The chief's eyes were clear, and a faint, serene smile touched his lips. He knew, and Arthur knew. "You shared your last meal," Tashunka whispered, his voice faint but clear. "A man who shares his last morsel with an enemy is no man's enemy. He is a protector." He reached out a trembling hand and grasped Arthur's arm. The grip was surprisingly firm. "My daughters, they will need a protector. In the path of the coming storm, a strong tree is needed." He gave Arthur directions, describing a landmarker trio of hawk-shaped rocks and a trail. He told him that he had instructed his eldest, Winona, that if he did not return from his vision quest within 10 days, she was to lead her sisters to the land of the Griefwalker, the man who lived by the silent creek. "A debt of honor," Tashunka breathed, his eyes closing. "Life for life, sanctuary for kindness." His hand went slack. His last breath was not a rattle or a gasp, but a gentle sigh, a release. The silence that followed was different from the one that had lived in the cabin before. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of a great man's passing and the burden of his final words. Arthur sat by the cot for a long time as the sun climbed the sky. He had invited a dying man in for his final moments. He had not expected to inherit his legacy. He buried Chief Tashunka on a small hill overlooking the creek, a place Cora had loved. He wrapped the body in his cleanest spare blanket and fashioned a marker from 2 sturdy branches bound with twine. It was a simple, respectful act. As he shoveled the last of the earth onto the mound, he felt a profound shift within him. The stasis had been broken. He was no longer just a man waiting to die. He was a man waiting for the arrival of 5 strangers, the daughters of a chief. He was the Griefwalker who had been named a protector. For a week he waited. The silence of the farm returned, but it was now a listening silence. Arthur found himself working with a renewed, if anxious, purpose. He mended the section of fence that had bothered him for months. He cleared a new patch for planting, his muscles protesting the unaccustomed labor. He was preparing for what he did not fully know. An invasion, a delegation, a misunderstanding that could get him killed. He cleaned the cabin, aired out Cora's things, and brought the cradle down from the loft, placing it near the hearth. It was not a conscious decision, but an instinct. He was making space. They arrived on the 8th day after Tashunka's death, just as the sun was beginning its descent. He saw them first as a small, tight group on the horizon, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of long travel. 5 women. As they drew closer, he could see they were leading 2 pack ponies laden with bundles. They stopped at the edge of his cleared land, just as their father had. The one in the lead, who could only be Winona, dismounted. She was tall and slender, with a bearing that mirrored her father's dignity. Her face was a study in controlled sorrow, her eyes holding the deep, quiet pain of a fresh loss. The other 4 women remained with the horses, their faces watchful, a mixture of fear, grief, and fierce loyalty. Arthur walked out to meet them, his hands open at his sides. He stopped a respectful distance away. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass, the only sound between them. "I am Winona," she said, her voice clear and steady, though laced with an undeniable strain. "Daughter of Tashunka." "I am Arthur Blackwood," he replied, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. "Your father, he is at peace. I buried him on that hill." He gestured with his chin toward the grave. Winona's gaze followed his, and for a moment the mask of control wavered. A profound sadness washed over her features before she mastered it again. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "He told us that if he did not return, we were to come here. He said we would find a man of honor, a protector." Her words hung in the air, a heavier burden than Arthur could have imagined. This was not a negotiation. It was the fulfillment of a promise he had never explicitly made. He looked past her to the other sisters. Istas, whose eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. Wachiwi, who seemed younger, her fear more visible on her face. Zitkala, who held herself with a warrior's posture, her hand resting near a knife at her belt. And Mina, the youngest, who clung to the side of one of the ponies, her large, dark eyes fixed on him with a child's unfiltered apprehension. "He called this a debt of honor," Winona continued, her eyes searching his face, looking for the man her father had described. "We do not come as beggars. We have skills. We know this land. We can hunt, forage, heal. We will work. We ask only for sanctuary, a place to live without fear, under the protection your kindness to our father has earned." It was a speech of incredible courage and desperation. They were offering themselves not as a dowry in the way his people would understand it, but as partners in a pact for survival. They were a family, displaced and vulnerable, seeking shelter from the storm their father had foreseen. Arthur thought of the settlement, of men like Garrett Vance, a rancher whose land bordered his own to the east. Vance was a man who saw the world in terms of possessions and power. He would not see 5 grieving women seeking sanctuary. He would see property to be claimed, or a threat to be eradicated. To take them in was to invite a war he was not sure he could win. To turn them away was to betray the memory of the chief he had fed and sheltered. It was to become the man he was before, the man made of stone. "Your father was a great man," Arthur said, the words feeling inadequate. "You are welcome here. There isn't much, but what I have is yours." Relief, so profound it was almost like a collapse, washed over Winona's face. Behind her, the shoulders of her sisters seemed to sag with it. The decision was made. The door to Arthur's quiet, grieving world had been thrown wide open, and a new, complicated, and dangerous future had just walked in. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of observation and accommodation. The sisters moved into the barn, refusing his offer of the cabin. They created their own space with a quiet, swift efficiency that amazed him, turning the dusty, hay-strewn interior into a clean, ordered dwelling. They communicated amongst themselves in the soft, flowing cadences of their own tongue, their voices a constant, low murmur that filled the silence Arthur had grown so accustomed to. They kept their word. From the first day they worked. Istas, it turned out, was a genius with plants. She walked the land with Arthur, pointing out roots and leaves he had always dismissed as weeds, explaining their uses for food and medicine. Within a week, she had revived his failing garden and started a new one, her hands seeming to coax life from the tired soil. Zitkala was the hunter and guardian. She moved through the surrounding woods with a silence that was unnerving, returning with rabbits or fowl, her presence a silent warning to any predators, 2-legged or 4. Wachiwi and Mina took over the domestic chores with a gentle competence. They mended Arthur's worn clothes, organized his chaotic larder, and cooked meals that were flavorful and nourishing, using ingredients foraged from the land. They brought an order and a warmth to the cabin that it had not known since Cora's time, and Winona was the leader, the fulcrum around which her sisters pivoted. She directed their efforts, acted as their spokeswoman, and was the one who dealt most directly with Arthur. Their interactions were formal, respectful, and freighted with unspoken things. Arthur would share his knowledge of farming, of crop rotation and irrigation from the creek, and Winona would listen, her intelligent eyes absorbing everything. In return, she would teach him about the rhythms of the prairie, the signs of changing weather in the behavior of insects, the ways of the animals. They were 2 teachers and 2 students from different worlds, finding common ground in the soil beneath their feet. Slowly, tentatively, the ice of Arthur's grief began to thaw. He found himself looking forward to the shared meals, no longer eaten in silence but filled with the sisters' quiet talk. He learned their individual personalities, Istas's dry, unexpected wit, Zitkala's fierce, protective loyalty, Wachiwi's artistic spirit, which she expressed by weaving intricate patterns into baskets and mats, Mina's shy smile, which slowly began to appear more often. And Winona. He found himself watching her most of all. He saw the immense burden she carried as the head of her family, the grief for her father that she held so tightly in check. He saw her strength, but he also saw glimpses of her vulnerability in the quiet moments when she thought no one was looking, when she would stand on the hill by her father's grave. A connection grew between them, unspoken and undefined. It was a bond forged in shared loss and a mutual growing respect. He saw her not as an Indian, not as a woman, but as a person of profound depth and integrity. And in her eyes, he began to feel he was no longer just the grief walker, but Arthur again. The farm began to breathe again. The fields were cleared and planted. The fences were mended and strong. The scent of cooking food and wood smoke once again meant home, not just survival. The change was palpable, a resurrection. But Arthur knew it was a fragile peace. The world did not stop at the borders of his land. The confrontation he had dreaded came in the form of Garrett Vance. Vance was a big man with a florid face and small, acquisitive eyes. He rode onto Arthur's property one afternoon with two of his hired hands, his expression a mixture of curiosity and contempt. He had clearly heard the rumors that had been festering in the settlement. "Blackwood," Vance boomed, his voice too loud for the quiet afternoon. He let his gaze sweep over the transformed farm, lingering on Wachiwi and Mina, who were tending the garden near the cabin. They immediately froze, their faces becoming still and guarded. Arthur walked out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He positioned himself between Vance and the women. "Vance," he said, his voice level. "Heard you've taken in some strays," Vance said, a cruel smirk on his lips. "Figured I'd come see for myself. You running a mission now?" His men snickered. His eyes were not on Arthur, but on the women, a blatant, appraising stare that made Arthur's blood run cold. "They're under my protection," Arthur stated simply. The words felt solid, real. He was no longer just saying them, he was living them. Just then, Winona and Zitkala emerged from the woods, returning from a hunt. Zitkala carried a brace of rabbits, and a bow was slung over her shoulder. They stopped short when they saw the riders, and Zitkala's hand went to the knife at her belt. Winona's face was unreadable, but she moved to stand with her younger sisters, her presence a shield. Vance's eyes lit up with a dangerous combination of lust and avarice. "Protection, or have you just bought yourself a whole stable of squaws?" He sneered. "Whatever you paid, I'll double it. A man gets lonely out here. Be a shame for them to go to waste on a sad case like you." Rage, clean and hot and utterly unfamiliar, surged through Arthur. It burned away the last vestiges of his apathy. This man was not just insulting him, he was defiling the memory of a chief, threatening a family, and desecrating the sanctuary he had promised to provide. "They are not for sale," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly quiet. "They are my family. This is their home, and you will get off my land, now." Vance was taken aback by the venom in Arthur's tone. He had known Arthur as the broken farmer, the man who had retreated from the world. This was someone else entirely. But his pride wouldn't let him back down easily. "Your family," he scoffed. "Don't be a fool, Blackwood. You know what these people are. This is an unnatural arrangement. The folks in town won't stand for it. They'll see you as a traitor to your own kind." "Then let them," Arthur said, taking a step forward. "My kind are the ones who honor their word. My kind are the ones who protect those in need." "I don't know what kind you are, Vance, but you are not welcome here." It was Winona who spoke next, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. She stepped forward, standing beside Arthur. She did not look at Vance, but at his hired hands, her gaze withering. "We are the daughters of Tashunka," she said, her English clear and precise. "We are not property. This man, Arthur Blackwood, is a man of honor. You are not. Your presence dishonors the ground where our father rests. Leave." The sheer force of her dignity, combined with Arthur's unyielding stance, shifted the balance. Vance's men shuffled their horses, suddenly uneasy. This was not the easy intimidation they had expected. Vance looked from Arthur's cold fury to Winona's imperious command, and he saw a united front he could not easily break. He was a bully, not a warrior. With a final venomous glare, he wrenched his horse's reins. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he spat. "You've made a powerful enemy today." He spurred his horse and galloped away, his men trailing behind him like jackals. Silence descended again, but it was a triumphant silence. Arthur's heart was hammering in his chest, his hands clenched into fists. He slowly turned to look at Winona. Her face was still impassive, but her eyes held a new light. It was a look of profound, unwavering respect. In that moment, the pact of survival was sealed in blood and fire, transformed into a bond of true alliance. The five sisters were no longer guests under his protection, and he was no longer their benefactor. They were, as he had said, a family. In the months that followed, life on the farm settled into a new equilibrium. The threat from Vance lingered, a shadow at the edge of their lives, but he did not return. The story of his humiliation at the hands of the grieving farmer and the chief's proud daughter had made the rounds, and for now it kept him at bay. The farm flourished as it never had before, a vibrant oasis of cooperation. It was a place where two cultures met and wove themselves together, creating something new and resilient. The cradle by the hearth was no longer a symbol of what was lost. Mina and Wachiwi would sometimes place their dolls in it, their quiet play a gentle exorcism of the sorrow that had clung to the object. The house was filled with the scents of baking bread and strange, delicious herbs. The fields were green with promise. The unspoken connection between Arthur and Winona deepened, growing in the quiet spaces between words. They would often work together in the evenings, mending tools or planning the next season's planting. They spoke of their pasts, of the people they had loved and lost. He told her more about Cora, about the bright, hopeful future they had planned. She told him of her mother, a wise woman who had taught her the responsibilities of leadership. They found solace in each other's stories, a shared understanding of grief's heavy weight. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, he finally spoke the thought that had been growing in his heart. "I think your father would be proud," Arthur said softly. "Of all of you, you've built a home here." Winona turned to him, her expression soft in the fading light. "He would be proud of you, Arthur Blackwood," she replied. "He saw the man you were, beneath the pain. You honored him, you honored us." She reached out and, for the first time, placed her hand over his on the arm of the chair. Her touch was warm, and it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated life through him. It was a feeling he thought he would never experience again. He looked out over his land, at the sturdy fences and the promising fields. He saw Istas and Zitkala walking back from the creek, their laughter carrying on the evening air. He saw the light glowing from the windows of the barn, a beacon of life. The crushing silence he had lived with for so long was a distant memory. His grief for Cora and his son would always be a part of him, a quiet room in the house of his heart, but it was no longer the whole house. Tashunka had come to his farm to die, but in doing so, he had brought Arthur back to life. He had arrived a man entombed by his past, a grief-walker lost in a wasteland of his own making. Now, surrounded by this unexpected, fierce and wonderful family, under the watchful eyes of the woman who saw him for who he truly was, he had found his way home. The prairie was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a beginning. The year was 1887, and the Arizona Territory was a place that baked hope out of a man, leaving behind a brittle husk. Ezra Donovan knew the feeling intimately. It was in the grit under his fingernails, the permanent stoop in his shoulders, and the quiet that had taken up residence in his soul after his wife, Martha, and their little boy were claimed by the fever 2 years prior. He was a prospector, but the only thing he'd found in the unforgiving earth was the reflection of his own emptiness. His pan always came up empty, mirroring the hollowed-out space in his chest where a family used to be. He had drifted south, a ghost haunted by the ghosts of his own making, until he found himself in the dusty, sun-bleached town of Purgatory Flats. The name felt fitting. It was here, in a haze of cheap whiskey and desperation, that he staked the last of his meager savings on a long shot. At a territorial auction held outside the saloon, where maps were tacked to a board peeling in the heat, he bought a mine. Not a promising claim, but a cursed one. The Serpent's Tooth. It was cold abandoned for a decade, known for yielding nothing but heartache and broken picks. It was cheap. So cheap that the auctioneer had laughed as he brought the gavel down. For Ezra, it was not an investment in a future of gold, but a purchase of a final, solitary place to fail. A place to be buried, perhaps, in the silence he had come to crave. The journey to his new property took 3 days by mule. The land grew more desolate with every mile, the saguaros standing like silent, thorny sentinels against a sky the color of faded denim. The heat was a physical weight. When he finally found it, tucked into the ochre flank of a low-slung mesa, the entrance to the Serpent's Tooth was little more than a jagged shadow, a gaping mouth in the rock face. The air that seeped from it was cool and smelled of damp earth and something else, something ancient and still. This was it, the end of the line. He felt no thrill of ownership, only a profound and weary sense of arrival. He tethered his long-suffering mule, Beatrice, to a desiccated ironwood tree, and taking a lantern, stepped out of the blinding sunlight into the gloom. He wasn't looking for a vein of silver or a glimmer of gold. He was looking for shelter from the sun, a place to unroll his bedroll and be swallowed by the earth. The tunnel went back some 20 feet before opening into a small, rough-hewn chamber. The lantern light pushed back the darkness, painting the rock walls in flickering shades of amber and brown. And then it caught something that was not rock. Ezra froze, his breath catching in his throat. In the far corner of the chamber, huddled together, were 3 figures. They were native women, their faces stark and still in the sudden glare. An old woman sat propped against the wall, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her dark eyes holding a weariness that dwarfed his own. Beside her, a younger woman, her daughter, he presumed had moved instinctively in front of a small girl, shielding her with her body. This woman's face was hard, her jaw set in defiance, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective fire that Ezra had not seen since he'd looked at Martha holding their son. The child, no more than 6 or 7, peered around her mother's leg, her expression a mixture of terror and solemn curiosity. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the drip of water somewhere deeper in the mine and the frantic hammering of Ezra's own heart. His mind, slow and stunned, struggled to process the scene. This was his mine, his property, paid for. These people were trespassers. The word formed in his head, cold and legal, but it felt absurd in the face of the 3 pairs of eyes locked on him. He had bought a place for his solitude, and instead he had found it occupied by the very sort of desperate life he was trying to escape. His first impulse was anger, a hot flare of indignation. He opened his mouth to shout, to order them out, to reclaim his small, pathetic patch of the world. But the words died on his lips. He saw the frayed edges of their buckskin clothes, the finely woven basket holding a few meager roots, the way the mother's hand rested on the child's shoulder, a gesture of absolute, unbreakable defense. He saw not intruders, but refugees. He saw in their silent, terrified tableau a story of loss and survival that resonated with the hollow spaces inside him. He lowered the lantern slightly, the light softening. He was a man who had lost everything. He could not, he realized with a sinking certainty, be the cause of someone else's final loss. He had come here to find a tomb, and had instead stumbled into a sanctuary, and he, the owner, was the invader. The standoff continued, thick with unspoken questions and primal fear. The mother, Alawa, kept her body positioned as a shield for her daughter, Kia. Her gaze never wavered from Ezra. She saw what she expected to see, a white man smelling of dust and sorrow, holding a lantern like a weapon. To her, he was the embodiment of the force that had driven them from their ancestral lands, the reason they were now living like rabbits in a hole in the ground. Her people had been scattered, her husband lost in a skirmish with soldiers months ago. All she had left was her mother, the wise elder Ha-O-Zin, and her child. She would die here, in this damp darkness, before she let him harm them. Ezra saw the animosity in her eyes, sharp and clear as flint. He understood it. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the confines of the cave. This is my claim, he managed, his voice rusty from disuse. The words were meaningless. The women did not speak his language, and even if they had, the deed he carried in his saddlebag held no authority here. The only law was the one in Alawa's eyes, the law of a mother protecting her young. He backed away slowly, retreating from the chamber and out of the mine's entrance into the blinding afternoon sun. He felt dizzy, disoriented. He stood there for a long time, listening to the buzz of insects and the soft shuffling of his mule. The anger had evaporated, replaced by a profound confusion. He was the legal owner, yet he felt like the intruder. He sank down onto a nearby rock, resting his head in his calloused hands. His plan for a quiet end had just become impossibly complicated. He could force them out, ride back to town and fetch the sheriff. They would be removed, sent to a reservation or worse. The thought soured in his gut. He had seen the reservations. They were prisons of dust and despair. That night, he made his camp 100 feet from the mine's entrance. He built a small, lonely fire, more for the illusion of company than for warmth. He could feel their presence in the dark moor of the hill, a silent, watchful wait. He imagined them huddled inside, listening to the crackle of his fire, wondering what he would do. He ate his meager meal of beans and hardtack, the food tasting like ash in his mouth. He was no longer alone in his desolation, and the realization was not a comfort, but a burden, a responsibility he did not want. Inside the mine, Ha-O-Zin coughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed off the rock. Alawa held a water skin to her mother's lips. The old woman's breathing was shallow. She had been fading for weeks, and the damp chill of the mine was not helping. "He has not left," Alawa whispered in their Apache tongue. Ha-O-Zin's eyes, clouded with age and illness, were still sharp with insight. "His spirit is broken," she murmured, her voice thin as a thread, like a wing-shot bird. "He brings no violence, not yet." She looked toward the entrance, a faint flicker of firelight barely visible. "We will wait. The land will decide." The days that followed fell into a tense, unspoken routine. Ezra would rise with the sun, his body aching, and begin the pointless work of prospecting. He chipped at the rock walls outside the mine, sifted dirt, his movements mechanical, born of a habit he couldn't break. He never entered the mine again. He left a small portion of his water and food, a piece of jerky, a handful of dried appleson, a flat rock near the entrance each morning. It was always gone when he returned from his work in the evening. It was his only form of communication, a gesture that was neither kindness nor threat, but a simple acknowledgement of their shared, precarious existence. He never saw them take it. He would catch glimpses of them, sometimes the child, Kia, darting out to snatch a piece of firewood before vanishing back into the shadows, or Alawa's silhouette at the entrance at dusk, watching him as he tended to his mule. They were ghosts, haunting the edges of his property and his life. The silence between them was immense, a chasm of culture, language, and history. Yet in that silence, he began to observe. He saw the resilience in their foraging, the quiet dignity of their confinement. He heard the grandmother's worsening cough carried on the night air and felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, a useless, aching sympathy. One afternoon, a week into this strange cohabitation, disaster struck in a mundane fashion. Ezra was working a rock face a short distance up the hillside when his footing gave way. He tumbled down a short, steep incline of loose scree, and his leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. A sharp, searing pain shot up from his ankle, and he cried out, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. He lay there for a moment, grit in his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. When he tried to put weight on the foot, a wave of nausea washed over him. The ankle was broken, badly. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the pain. He was miles from anywhere. No one knew he was here. He was alone, injured, with a dwindling water supply. He dragged himself, grimacing, toward his camp, the journey of a few hundred yards taking the better part of an hour. By the time he reached the flat ground near the mine, he was pale and trembling with shock and exertion. He collapsed near his cold fire pit, his leg swelling rapidly, the pain a relentless, throbbing drum. He lay there as the sun began to set, the sky bruising into shades of purple and orange. Despair, a familiar old companion, settled over him. This was how it would end. Not in a quiet fading, but in a slow, agonizing demise from thirst and infection. He closed his eyes, a bitter laugh catching in his throat. He had bought his own grave after all. He must have drifted into a stupor, because when he opened his eyes again, a shadow was falling over him. Alawa stood there, her face unreadable in the twilight. She looked at his swollen, discolored ankle, then back at his face. For a long moment, she did nothing, her expression a mask of stone. Ezra expected her to turn and walk away. Why should she help him? He was her enemy, the man who had laid claim to her refuge. His presence was a threat, and his death would remove it. But then, after an eternity of silence, she knelt. Her movements were fluid and economical. She did not speak. She gestured toward his leg, a silent question. Ezra, too weak and pained to do anything else, gave a slight, jerky nod. She disappeared back into the mine and returned moments later with her mother. Ha-O-Zin, moving slowly and leaning on her daughter for support, knelt beside him. Her breathing was labored, but her eyes were clear and focused. She examined the injury with hands that were surprisingly gentle. She murmured something to Alawa, who then left and came back with two straight, sturdy pieces of wood from their small pile and strips of buckskin. Working together, they created a crude but effective splint. Their touch was impersonal, practical. There was no tenderness in it, but there was an undeniable competence, a knowledge born of a life lived close to hardship. As Alawa tightened the last strip of leather, Ezra met her eyes. The fire was still there, but beneath it he saw something else, a reluctant acknowledgement of a shared humanity. A dead man would bring soldiers, trackers. A living man, even an enemy, was a known quantity. Theirs was an act not of compassion, but of desperate pragmatism. Yet for Ezra, lying helpless on the ground, it felt like a profound act of grace. For the next several days, Ezra was a prisoner of his injury. He lay on his bedroll, feverish and in pain, drifting in and out of a restless sleep. The women tended to him in their detached, efficient way. They brought him water. Alawa learned to brew his bitter coffee over the fire. She would leave a cup for him beside his bedroll without a word. Ha-O-Zin, despite her own frailty, would inspect his leg each day. She made a poultice from crushed leaves and mud that she applied to the swelling. It smelled earthy and strange, but it cooled the fire in his flesh. And then there was the child, Kia. She would watch him from a distance, her large, dark eyes filled with a solemnity that did not belong on a child's face. One afternoon as he lay awake, he saw her scratching in the dirt with a stick. She was drawing pictures of his mule, Beatrice, with a surprising accuracy. The sight sent a sharp, painful memory through him, his own son, Thomas, drawing lopsided horses in the dust outside their cabin. The grief was so sudden, so acute, it felt like a physical blow. A low sound, a choked sob, escaped his lips before he could stop it. Kia froze, her eyes wide. She looked at him, at the tears tracking through the grime on his cheeks, and for the first time the fear in her expression was replaced by something else. A flicker of childish empathy. She looked at her drawing, then back at him, and slowly, hesitantly, she walked over and laid the stick she had been drawing with beside his hand. Then she scurried back to the safety of the mine's entrance. It was a small gesture, but it cracked something open in Ezra. The shell of grief and bitterness he had built around himself fractured. That evening, he spent over an hour painstakingly carving a small piece of scrap wood with his pocket knife. He shaped it into a rough but recognizable bird. The next morning, when he left the customary portion of food on the rock, he placed the small wooden bird beside it. Later, from his bedroll, he saw Kia creep out and snatch it up, her eyes bright with wonder before she vanished back into the dark. The splint, the poultice, the shared water, the wooden bird, these were the first words spoken in their silent world. The chasm between them began to close, inch by painful inch. Alawa's face softened from a mask of pure hostility into one of weary watchfulness. She began to speak to him, not in words he could understand, but with her eyes. They would hold a silent conversation over the flames of the nightly fire, which she now built for them both. One evening, as Hao Xin sat near the fire, her breathing more ragged than usual, she pointed a trembling finger at herself and whispered a word. "Ha, O Xin." Then she pointed to her daughter, Alawa, and finally, to the girl clutching the wooden bird, Kia. She looked at Ezra, her gaze expectant. He understood. He pointed to himself. "Ezra," he said, his own name sounding foreign on his tongue. He had not said it aloud in months. It was a beginning. The names gave them shape, pulling them from the realm of anonymous threats and trespassers into the sphere of individuals. The rigid lines of their separate camps began to blur. Ezra, now able to hobble on a crude crutch, began collecting more firewood than he needed, adding it to their pile. Alawa, in turn, would sometimes leave a small bowl of a savory stew made from roots and a snared rabbit next to his plate of beans. They ate together now, separated by the fire, the silence no longer heavy with suspicion, but with a quiet, shared understanding. Ezra learned that Hao Xin's cough was an old affliction, a weakness in her lungs that the spirits had touched long ago. He learned that Alawa's hands, though calloused and strong, could weave intricate patterns into baskets and mend clothes with the finest of stitches. He learned that Kia's solemnity could break into sudden, silent laughter when his mule, Beatrice, nuzzled her hand looking for a treat. He saw not just a family, but the remnants of a proud people, clinging to their existence with a strength that humbled him. He, in turn, became more than just the white man who owned the mine. They saw him wince in pain, saw the deep sorrow that settled in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. They saw him mend Beatrice's harness with patient hands. They saw him stare at the stars at night, his expression one of profound and unending loss. In his brokenness, they began to see a reflection of their own. They were all survivors, adrift in a harsh world. One crisp autumn afternoon, as a cool wind whispered down from the mesas, the fragile peace of their strange coexistence was shattered. The sound came first, the clatter of horses' hooves on rock, the coarse laughter of men. Ezra, who was reinforcing the support timbers at the mine's entrance, felt a cold dread wash over him. Alawa appeared at his side in an instant, her face pale, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. She pulled Kia behind her, her body once again becoming a shield. 3 riders appeared over the rise. The man in the lead was large and florid-faced, with a self-satisfied smirk that Ezra recognized instantly. It was Garrett Vance, the town land agent who had overseen the auction. He was flanked by 2 rough-looking men with rifles resting easy in their saddles. "Well, well, Donovan," Vance called out, his voice slick with false bonhomie. He let his eyes roam over the campsite, lingering on the mine entrance and the women partially hidden behind Ezra. "Looks like you found more than just rock up here. I heard whispers that old Chief Nahil's family had vanished into these hills. Heard they were sitting on his silver cache." Ezra's blood ran cold. This wasn't about his claim, it was about them, about a greedy rumor. He moved to stand more fully in front of the mine entrance, his bad leg throbbing a painful rhythm. "There's no silver here, Vance," he said, his voice low and steady. "And these people are under my protection. This is my property. You need to leave." Vance laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped against the quiet air. "Your property? You bought a worthless hole in the ground. "The real prize," he said, nodding toward the women, "is right there. Now, you can be sensible. Stand aside, and I might even cut you in for a share of what we find. Or you can be a fool." He patted the stock of the rifle in its scabbard. The threat was plain. Ezra looked from Vance's avaricious face to Alawa's terrified one. In that moment, something shifted irrevocably inside him. The weary resignation that had defined his life for 2 years burned away, replaced by a clean, hot anger. These women had shown him more humanity in a few weeks than he had received from his own kind in years. They had mended his body and, in their quiet way, had begun to mend his spirit. He had come here to die, but now, standing between a helpless family and a greedy man, he found something to live for, or at least something to fight for. "I said leave," Ezra repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than Vance's bluster. He picked up a heavy pickaxe that was leaning against the rock, his knuckles white around the handle. He was one man, crippled and outgunned, but he was no longer broken. Vance's smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Have it your way, prospector." He looked at his men. "We'll be back tomorrow. And we won't be so polite." He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. They kicked up a cloud of dust as they rode away, their laughter echoing back like a curse. The dust settled, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than the confrontation itself. Kiya was crying softly, her face buried in her mother's side. Alawa's face was ashen, the old fear back in her eyes, sharper than ever. She looked at Ezra, her gaze filled with a terrible, dawning despair. He had tried to protect them, but he had only delayed the inevitable. He had made them a target. That night, there was no pretense of separation. They huddled together around a low fire, the vast, starry sky pressing in on them. The fragile world they had built was about to be torn apart. Hao Zin, her voice raspy but firm, spoke for a long time in their language, Alawa translating for Ezra in a quiet, halting mix of Spanish and the few English words she had learned. "He seeks the shining stone," she explained. "It is a story, a legend. My husband's people. They did not hide silver. They protected this place. This mountain." Hao Zin gestured to the rock around them. "It is a place of spirits, a place for birthing and for dying. The treasure is not in the ground. It is the ground itself." Ezra finally understood. They weren't guarding a treasure, they were guarding their home, their history, their very soul. And Vance, in his ignorance and greed, would destroy it all to find something that didn't exist. "We can't stay here," Ezra said, the words heavy with defeat. "We have to run." Alawa shook her head, a flicker of the old defiance in her eyes. "My mother cannot travel far. Kia is small. They will catch us in the open." A grim silence fell. They were trapped. Ezra looked at the pickaxe still resting by his side. He looked at the dark entrance of the mine. He had been a prospector for 20 years. He knew rock. He knew leverage, and he knew desperation. A desperate idea, born of that knowledge, began to form in his mind. It was a fool's plan, a gamble against impossible odds. But it was all they had. "No," he said softly, looking from Alawa to Hao Zin. "We won't run. We will make our stand, here." They worked through the night under the cold light of the moon. There was no longer a language barrier. Their shared purpose was a language of its own. Guided by Ezra's knowledge of mining, they set to work. He showed Alawa which support timbers were critical and which could be weakened without bringing the whole entrance down on their heads. They used his tools to chip away at a key section of the rock wall above the entrance, creating a precarious overhang. They gathered loose rock and piled it carefully, creating the foundation for a small, targeted rock slide. It was back-breaking, frantic work, fueled by adrenaline and fear. Kia, seeing her mother's fierce determination, helped by carrying smaller stones, her small face set with a grave resolve. Hao Zin, too weak to work, sat chanting softly, her voice a thin, reedy prayer in the darkness. By dawn they were exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, but they were ready. A single, large timber, precariously balanced, was all that held the trap in place. A strong pull on a rope made from braided leather and strips of Ezra's blanket would bring it all down. They retreated deep into the mine, into the main chamber where Ezra had first found them, and waited. The darkness was absolute, the silence broken only by their own ragged breathing and the ever-present drip of water, like a slow, patient clock ticking toward doom. Vance returned, as promised, just after the sun had climbed above the eastern mesas. He had brought 4 men with him this time. They rode with an arrogant swagger, rifles held at the ready. "Donovan," Vance bellowed, his voice echoing off the rock. "Last chance, send out the women." Silence was his only answer. "Fools," Vance snarled. He dismounted, gesturing for 2 of his men to follow him toward the mine's entrance. "We'll drag 'em out." Inside, Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs. He held the rope in his sweating palms. Alawa stood beside him, holding a heavy rock, her knuckles white. Kia was huddled behind her grandmother, her face pressed into the old woman's back. This was it. Everything hinged on the next few moments. They heard the crunch of boots on gravel as Vance and his men stepped under the overhang and into the mouth of the tunnel. "It's dark as pitch in here," one of the men complained. "Light a torch." "Now," Ezra whispered. With a shared grunt of effort, he and Alawa threw their combined weight onto the rope. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a great groaning crack, the main timber shifted. Outside, a shout of alarm was cut short by a deafening roar. The rock face they had weakened gave way, and tons of rock and earth cascaded down, completely sealing the entrance of the mine in a thick, impenetrable cloud of dust. The chamber was plunged into an even deeper blackness. The roar subsided, replaced by the tinkle of falling pebbles, and then a ringing silence. From the other side of the rockfall, they could hear muffled shouts of pain and panicked cries from the men who had remained outside. They had trapped Vance and his 2 men, but they had also buried themselves alive. The minutes stretched into an eternity. They were entombed. The air grew thick with dust. Kia began to cough, a small, frightened sound. Hao Xin held her close, murmuring to her. Suddenly, from the other side of the rubble, came a muffled, desperate pounding. "Help!" It was Vance's voice, thin and terrified. "Get us out! I'm trapped." Ezra felt a grim satisfaction, but it was short-lived. He had saved them from Vance, but he had condemned them all to a slow death in the dark. Despair, blacker than the mine itself, washed over him. He had failed. But then Hao Xin spoke, her voice surprisingly strong in the enclosed space. Alawa lit their last lantern, the small flame, a defiant pinprick of hope. The old woman pointed not toward the blocked entrance, but deeper into the mine, down a narrow, unexplored shaft that Ezra had assumed was a dead end. "There is another way," Alawa translated, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. "The way of the spirits, a wind cave. My people have known of it for generations." With the lantern held high, Ezra followed them. Hao Xin, leaning heavily on her daughter, led them down the narrow passage. The air grew cooler, and soon they could feel a faint, fresh breeze on their faces. The tunnel opened into a vast, natural cavern, filled with strange, beautiful rock formations that glittered in the lantern light, and there, on the far side, was a sliver of daylight. It was a narrow fissure, a hidden exit on the far side of the mesa, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. They were free. When they emerged into the sunlight, blinking like newborns, the world felt different. The air had never tasted so sweet, the sky had never seemed so blue. Below them, they could hear Vance's remaining men struggling to dig through the rock slide, their panicked shouts echoing up the canyon. They would not be found. They did not look back. Ezra abandoned his mule, his tools, his claim, the last vestiges of his old life. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs, a single water skin, and the small wooden bird clutched in Kia's hand. Ha-O-Zin, though weak, seemed to have found a new strength. She pointed toward a distant purple mountain range. "There," Alawa said, "a hidden valley, a place to be safe." Ezra looked at the small family beside him. Ha-Zin, the keeper of their past. Alawa, their fierce protector. Kiya, their future. He was no longer a prospector searching for worthless metal. He was a man who had been buried and reborn. He had stumbled into a stranger's sanctuary and, in defending it, had found his own. The journey ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, Ezra Donovan was not walking alone. He had lost a family to the harshness of the world, but in its deepest, most desolate corner, against all odds, he had found another. The land ahead was vast and empty, but his heart, for the first time in a very long time, was full.